Hi, my name is Kerry Critchlow from RCR Recording Studios, and today we're going to talk about sound design and synthesis. Sound design can be used for a lot of different things. Oftentimes, you're going to hear it in like movies, films, radio. Well, back in the day, radio programs, and that's mostly in the like the Foley type of scenario. Foley is basically when you replace sounds with other sounds. So, for instance, if you're watching a movie and in the movie there's a scene where it's raining, you're probably not hearing actual rain. You're probably hearing frying bacon, which simulates the sound of rain in that movie. And when you hear footsteps, you're not actually hearing somebody walking. You're hearing somebody coming up with a sound that sounds like walking in some kind of a controlled environment. And so we're not focusing on the Foley aspect of things today. We're going to be focusing more on the musical end of things as opposed to the kind of sound creation that would be used by like Hollywood or like movies, film, TV, that kind of stuff. Where like they're going to create sounds like a lightsaber, which combines a lot of and sometimes they use the techniques we're going to go through in this audio synthesis, but it's kind of a different animal. And if you want to get into Foley and how to create kind of sound effects like that, there's a lot of other great resources out there that you can look into, but that's not what we're going to cover today. What we're going to cover today is primarily synthesis when it comes to sound design and being able to create musical sounds that you can use in your audio productions. And so the first question you might want to ask is, what is audio synthesis? And that is, synthesis is the process of creating new sounds by manipulating and combining different audio sources. And there's several different ways that we can go about doing that. Today's video, we're not going to get into the weeds really about any of this stuff. This is a broad overview of the types of synthesis that is available and kind of maybe a brief look at what each one can kind of do to a degree. Although I'm not an expert in all of the types of synthesis out there, our main focus is probably going to be mostly in subtractive synthesis because that's what I'm most familiar with, and it's probably the most broad and most easy to use, I guess, for lack of a better word. But we'll get into some of this other stuff in some detail as well. But first, we'll just go over the different types of synthesis. And so we have, and this is not comprehensive, there's other synthesis that exists out there as well. Some of which we might touch on, but this is just sort of a broad outline of some of the different types of synthesis that you can do when it comes to creating some musical sounds. So we have additive synthesis. Additive synthesis builds a sound by combining sine waves with different frequencies and amplitudes. We have subtractive synthesis, and this is what I'm most familiar with. It's probably the most easy, or not easy, but like the most popular, the most the broadest. I'm not sure if I'm using these words correctly, but subtractive synthesis starts with a rich waveform and then removes harmonics with a filter, and we'll get into that as well. Wavetable synthesis uses a table of switchable frequencies to create a sound. Frequency modulation uses a modulator signal to shape another signal called the carrier signal. Granular synthesis breaks down an audio sample into small parts or grains and then plays them back in different orders. Physical modeling digitally recreates the process that create a sound. And vector synthesis combines several small sounds segment to create a new sound. There's other stuff like modular synthesis and yeah, there's other stuff out there, and we'll touch on some of that. But this is just a brief introduction. And so we're going to go over sort of the kind of the basics of what a synthesizer is. And a synthesizer is just either a hardware or software program that allows you to synthesize these sounds. And they'll do that in various different ways. And so we'll come here and we will open up a synthesizer here. Now, there's all sorts of synthesizers. this one, and some synthesizers will do multiple synthesis types of synthesis. Like some can do additive, subtractive, wavetable, frequency, FM. Some of them will do multiples of this. Some will focus on just one. And so there's all sorts of different types of synthesizers out there, both hardware and software. Obviously, we're going to be focusing more on the software side of things, but all the software stuff was built on their analog, you know, um, uh, predecessors, I guess, for lack of a better word. And so this may look extremely complex, and it is. There's a lot going on here, but it can be broken down pretty succinctly into different sections of how this can all kind of come together and work. This is called an Anna 2 by Slate Digital. It's a great synthesizer if you're looking to get into this kind of thing. But there's all sorts out there, and they all are going to have similar. They're all going to kind of do the same thing. They're going to create the synthesis process, and they can do it in either they can do it in different ways or multiple ways, or focus on one specific type of way of doing it. I am just going to break down the most basic components of what your average synthesizer has in it, and then you should we'll go into the ways that you can do the different types of synthesis later. But at the end of the day, you're just creating sounds that you can use to incorporate into your audio production. So the first thing we're going to look at is the oscillators. Now, if you've watched some previous videos, you should understand what oscillators are and how they kind of work. We've gone over the 4 basic types of oscillators before: your saws, your sines, your squares, your triangles. And these are all just different, these are the basic sort of building blocks of synthesis, all right? We're going to take these simple looking waveforms here, and then we're going to manipulate them in order to create new sounds. And we can do that in different ways. So, like, for instance, if we look at additive synthesis builds a sound by combining sine waves with different frequencies and amplitudes. Well, what that means in practice then is that if we start with a sine wave, we can then create multiple copies of this sine wave, add them together, play with different aspects of them, including volume, which would be the amplitude, how loud or quiet it is, how fast it's cycling, which would be frequency. We can play with various phase things, and if we add enough of these together, eventually it will come together to create just about any type of sound wave that there is. And we'll get into that in the future, but I'm just kind of give you a preface. Now, there are also complex waveforms. So these are the 4 basic waveforms: your saw, your sine, your square, and your triangle. And if you've been keeping up with us, you understand what these are. You also have more complicated sine waves, or not sound. You also have more complicated waveforms that start to look a little bit more interesting, right? If we just kind of go through this list here of preloaded waveforms, you can sort of see the different types of waveforms that could possibly exist here. You also have ultra complex as well. Like these types of things here. But they're all built off of the basic waveforms in one way or another. They all kind of come from that, and we'll get into that as well. But I just wanted to show you that waveforms can look all sorts of different ways and sound different ways. So if we were to, for instance, play this sound, and actually what we'll do real quick, just as a reminder, is go over the 4 basic ones here. So we have a saw, which looks like a sawtooth, right? We have a sine wave. We have a square. And a triangle. Now, a sine wave is going to be your purest type of wave. It's the smoothest. It has the least amount of distortion or like anything else. It's considered a pure tone. Then when we get the next up from that would be a triangle. It's not quite as pure as a sine wave, but still sounds relatively smooth. Kind of just adding a little bit of grit. Then you have a square, which would be the next kind of harshest, if you will. And then saw is going to have the most harshness. All right. And then we have some, interesting, more complex sine waves here, or sound waves, not sine waves, sorry. Now, this almost sounds kind of triangle-ish because you can see it's kind of triangle-ish, right? Looking for something a little bit more interesting here. This could be kind of saw wavy almost, or triangle-y as well. Yeah. And so you have all of these types of shapes that you can use to start with, okay? So these are your oscillators, and you can combine different oscillators together. This particular program will allow you to combine up to 3 different oscillators at the same time. So if we wanted to, we could have a saw being played, a sine wave being played, and a square being played, all at the same time. And the way we would do that is in this particular software. Now, different softwares are going to have maybe different labeling for different things, but we have right here what's called voices. If we have 0 voices, that means nothing's happening. No sound is being played. When we add 1 voice in, that means we're adding 1 instance of this cycle. And if we come over to our sine wave and we want to add in our sine wave on top of that, on top of our saw, we're going to add 1 voice to it. And now we're going to hear both a sine wave and a saw play together. And then we'll add in our square. And now all 3 of them are going to be playing at the same time. We're going to hear a saw, a sine, and a square all being played at the same time. And what we're going to do real quickly is we're going to turn this down because it's starting to get a little loud when we add all of these waves on top of each other. We're just going to play a single note here, and we are going to convert it into an audio track, and we're just going to take a look at what's going on under the hood here. And as you can see, when we zoom in, this is the waveform that combining all 3 of those makes. It's not a saw, it's not a square, and it's not a sine. It's its own unique thing, right? And you can see what it looks like here when you combine those 3 together. And it just repeats on and on. So a saw looks like, kind of a rise and then a sharp dip and then a rise and a sharp dip. A sine is a smooth looking thing, and then a square is very squarish, 90 degree up, down, that kind of thing. And so you can start to see that when you combine these waves, they create their brand new thing altogether. Now, you can also increase the voices, and we'll get more into the detail of all of this stuff in the future, but just as a sort of a precursor, you can add more multiple voices to all of this, and this just increases kind of like, well, let's turn all of this off for now, and we're just going to listen to the wave with one voice. All right, and we can zoom back out a little bit here and put a loop on it. And then if we increase the voices, now it's going to sound a little bit chorused. And we've gone over the chorus effect. And we can add more voices. And now we got some like flangery, chorusy kind of stuff going on. And if you've kept up with our videos, you should understand this kind of thing. And the more voices we add, the more complex the sound wave gets. So if we were to, what do we have? 5 voices. So if we were to then convert this into an audio wave and zoom in on it, it's no longer going to look exactly like a saw. It's got a little bit more complexity happening in it now, right? And some stereo information, meaning they're not, the top and the bottom, the left and right do not match up perfectly with each other. And so you get some very interesting stereo effects as well when you start combining these multiple voices together. And this particular program allows you to go all the way up to 9 voices. And if we were to zoom in on that, this is what it looks like. And you can see that it's evolving as it goes. So it's not even staying the same as it's being played. You can sort of start to see the sound wave change over time on the top as well. And it's being modulated. The sound is changing over time. And that's because we're adding these different layers and voicings on top of each other as it's being played. Now, we're going to go back to our single instance of our sawtooth here. And what we can do with that then is, this is our oscillator section. Now we'll get into what some of this other stuff is later down the road. Over here we have a sampler section. So this allows us to take samples of other things and use that as an oscillator as well. Or as our starting sound, what we will ultimately be manipulating or combining together. And so, and we can combine these samples with these waveforms as well. So like a sample could be anything. It could be a piano, it could be a voice, it could be a complex waveform of something that you can combine and manipulate. And we'll get into that as well later. But this particular software allows you to do some to do that kind of thing. Anyways, after we have our oscillator section here at the top, we're also going to have a filter section. Now, filter sections is just EQ, all right? And this allows us to use different types of EQ. We have Rolly, Moggy, or Moogie or whatever, like various things. LP is low pass, HP is high pass, BP is band pass, and these just allow us to filter this saw so that we can get some different types of sounds. So we can do, for instance, a low pass, which allows our lows to pass through and cuts off the highs, and so it might start to sound, sorry about that, the volume was dipping a bit. Hopefully this is better. But anyways, what we can do is now cut off some of the high-end information that we were getting from that saw. Or bring it back in. And we get a little bit of control over that. And we can do different types of things. We can even do phaser sounds. If you watch our flanger and phaser video, you should understand this, the poles and kind of how they work as well. and that creates kind of that sort of phasery sort of sound when we do this. And so these are just different types of EQs that we can use to manipulate our sound. All right, and that's all the EQ section is doing, is just allowing us to EQ our sound a little bit, to either take off the highs, lows, use different types of EQs to just kind of change the sound of our waveform here. All right, and then what we have is our envelope section. Now the envelope section is where a lot of the magic happens, or the shaping of the sound. And these envelopes, this is the amplitude envelope, and this is the main shaper of our sound. There's also other envelopes here that we can employ for our EQ or our modulation and things like that. But for right now, we're going to focus on the amp envelope. And these envelopes are always going to be ADSR, and that's attack, decay, sustain, and release. Excuse me. The attack is how fast the sound will start. So for instance, if we have a very fast attack, that means the sound is going to happen immediately as soon as we hit the key or hit the play button or what have you. It's immediately happening. If we were to increase this attack, it will take some time for the sound to start happening. It's going to fade in, so to speak. So you can think of the attack as sort of a fade. You can either have a no fade at all, a minimal fade, or like a slow fade. And the higher this is, the longer it takes for the sound to happen. All right. The decay is how much the sound will drop once it reaches the height of the attack, if you will. The sustain is how long the note will hold for, or the volume, I guess, at which it will be held at. So a visual representation might help with this kind of thing. I'm not sure what a good way to do that would be off the top of my head. But essentially, you can think of the attack as how long it takes for the sound to start happening. The decay is the point at which the sound will start to drop in volume. Sustain is the volume it will stay at. And release is what happens when you let go of the key, if you will, or like if you're playing on a keyboard or whatever. When you let go of that key, how long will it take for the sound to go away? So hopefully this makes sense, but and I'll say it one more time just to kind of hammer it home. Attack is how long it takes for the sound to reach its top volume. Decay is how when it will start to drop in volume. Sustain is the volume it will be held at if you hold it long enough. And when you're holding out the note, that sustain is the volume at which it will be held at, and then the release is what happens when you let go of the key. So if we were to, say, take off our looper here, and we drop our release all the way off, or bring it all the way down, as soon as it hits this point, the sound is going to stop. Now, if we were to increase our release, what you'll hear is that after it hits this point, it's going to start to fade out a little bit. And the longer we have that release, the longer it will take for this to fade out. All right. So again, attack is how long it takes our sound to reach its full volume, or to reach the peak volume. The decay is how much of a dip in volume you want to have happen, and then the sustain is the volume that it will stay at until you let go of the key or let go of the note. And this is how you can create various types of sounds. So, for instance, if you wanted to have more of a a piano-y sound, you could have kind of this sort of thing. Kind of like pulsy, but you can hear that volume goes up and then it gets quiet. So it starts loud and then gets quiet over time. And if you have your decay and release at the same point, essentially it's just going to be the loudest. It won't decay at all. It'll just get to the top to its highest volume and then just stay there. But if you have your sustain lower than your decay, the volume will go up, hit this, and then come down. And you get pulsy types of sounds like that. So the note's still playing, but because we have a decay that drops very low to kind of a zero volume here and no release and a very, very short release, it's going to kind of just go away as soon as it's played. And we can all right. And you can do all sorts of use this to create all sorts of fun little sounds. The swell that just kind of goes away. All right. So the ADSR, attack, decay, sustain, release, this is going to be a great way to shape the type of sound you're going to get from your oscillator, your waveform, in combination with your filters and things like that. But this is a great way to shape your sound and figure out kind of what you want it to do, right? So this would be kind of more of a sort of a standard way of just a held out note, and then it goes away. But you can also have that note disappear. You can have it swell and all sorts of things. You can play around with this and have a lot of fun with it to create some cool things. But you can think of this as just volume controls, right? And it's controlling the volume over time. So attack is how long it takes for the sound to reach its maximum volume. Decay is when it starts to drop in volume. Sustain is how long, at what point it stays at a consistent volume as you're playing it. And release is how long it will continue to play after the note is released. So I'm hoping this all makes sense. So, so after our envelope, or our amplitude envelope section, amplitude for volume, you can think of this as just volume. We then have our LFO section, all right? And we've gone over LFOs, low frequency oscillators, and it's just ways to assign parameters that will change the sound over time according to what type of waveform you choose, whether it's a sine, triangle, square, etc. And then you can assign different parameters, whether it's volume, pitch, filters, all and other things that we'll get into as well as we go and dive into the more complex versions of what this can do. But this is essentially what a synthesizer is. Those are the four main components of your standard synthesizer. You have your oscillator or your waveform generator, your wavetable, whatever you want to call it, but the place that generates your sound. You have, and some of them will be very complex and allow for a lot of kind of flexibility. Some of them will be very simple, but you can do a lot with simple. So like, you don't need this particular software in order to create some cool sounds. And that being said, every synthesizer is going to have these kind of, well, most synthesizers, different synthesis won't have all of these, but this is the kind of basics of synthesizers, right? You're going to have your oscillator, your filter section, your envelope section, and your LFO section, all right? And so that is the basics of a synthesizer, and then we can go into the other components here in a little bit. But and we're going to do that in future videos, but I want to first just show you a different type of synthesizer so that you kind of get an idea as well. So we'll bring this down here. Actually, that's not the one I wanted to use. So, there we go. Okay, and so again, this is another type of synthesizer. It's called Zeta plus 2. It's not important, but it's another synthesizer, and it looks different, right? Looks in some ways simplified, in other ways more complex, but it's the same kind of thing as our Ana 2. We have our oscillator section here where we can choose our different types of sine or sound waves that we want to use, our oscillator section here. So we can choose, saws or squares or what have you. We can have a sine wave. So like this is our oscillator section. This one has 6 oscillators that you can use to combine together if you want. And and it also has some other options on how you can maybe mess with the sine wave here. But we'll get more into that later as well. But we have our oscillator section. We have our filter section in which we can which we can choose what type of filters we want. This one doesn't have quite as many options as far as filters as the Ana, but you don't really necessarily need to. You can just have some fun with this. But we have a low pass here, high pass, band pass, and some resonant stuff, comb. So we have some different filter options here. Then we have our envelope section here with our attack, our decay, our sustain, and our release. And then this has a little bit of extra thing, but this one actually is a great visual representation of our envelope section. So this might be a good time to spend looking at this. All right, so we have our attack, and this is how long it will take for our sound to happen. We have our decay, which is how long it will take, which is like, think of this as the volume. The volume will turn up, it will turn down, it will stay at this volume, and then it eventually will fade out based upon this release. In this case, the volume will just drop immediately and stop. So if we were to did I delete our? Oh, I did. Oops. turn this down some. That is what we want to initialize. And so we'll just choose a saw again. All right. It's a little smoother, different shape, but it's a saw. And then we have our filter. So we were using I think a high pass before, or low pass. Anyways, so we'll go back to our ADR. So our attack is how long it will take for this to get to its top volume. And it doesn't even reach its top volume because we have it set so long. It won't get to its top volume before we hit here. Then we have our decay. And this is going to slowly rise in volume. It's going to drop in volume, and then it's going to rise back up to where we have our sustain. So it's going to be, and you heard it kind of drop in volume briefly. All right. And then it comes back to where our sustain is. We can bring our sustain level down. So now what's going to happen is it's going to reach top volume, it's going to drop in volume, and then it's going to stay at this volume until we let go of the note. And so this is a good visual representation of what these ADSR envelopes are doing, okay? And so this is our amp envelope section here. And then we have an LFO section. And this is the same thing. We can choose what we want it to be, and then we can choose, what we want it to affect. And yeah, so every synthesizer is going to be kind of the same thing. Not every time. I said that wrong. A lot of synthesizers are going to have very similar types of things, and all the basic synthesizers are going to have an oscillator section, a filter section, an envelope section, and an LFO section. And then down here, this is a way to control your LFOs. So what you want the LFO to be doing, essentially. And so, yeah. Hopefully this is all making sense and you're kind of understanding the basic principles of synthesizers. Now we're going to get into the different types of synthesizers, the different types of synthesis, if you will, and how the synthesizers do these in future videos. But this is just an introduction to synthesis and sound design, how to create sounds. And so you can kind of, with today's video, you should have at least a basic understanding of how to go about creating some new sounds and figuring out how to kind of start to manipulate these waves in ways that will kind of start to get you these sounds. And then we'll go through some of the other sections as well. For instance, this also has a like an effect section here. Not all synthesizers will have an effect section, but a lot of them will, and those effects can be like choruses or delays, reverbs, compressions, distortions, all sorts of things, EQs, extra EQ. So like there's other stuff that we can go into, and certain and other options. But I'm just trying to give you the concept that different synthesizers, while they may look different, kind of operate very similarly for the most part. Certain synthesis requires more specific types of synthesizers or there are ways to do this, all of this synthesis stuff, we can actually do manually as well. So you don't necessarily need a synthesizer in order to create the synthesis process. They are just specialized in doing it and can make a lot of this type of process much easier to do. But you can also do it manually without a synthesizer. So we're going to spend future videos getting into the different types of synthesis and how you can use them to create some cool sounds. We'll also go into more details about the synthesis process and how to like dig into the synthesizers and really have them create some cool things. And we'll look at different synthesizers in order to give you sort of a broad understanding of different interfaces and different ways that you can, or the different synthesizers that exist out there. There's countless out there. It gets ridiculous sometimes, but you can, like here's another synthesizer based on a retro machine. And so, yeah, you have your oscillator section here. You have your filter section here. You have your kind of ADSR section here. It's a little less robust, we'll say, but like this is based on an older vintage synthesizer. And then you have your sound effects here. You have your LFO section. And so like a lot of synthesizers are going to have very similar types of functionality. And so you can get some very cool results from different synthesizers and how they kind of, just because they have a different interface or they look maybe different from one another doesn't mean that they aren't operating similarly, right? So we still have our same sort of basic setup here. It's just that this particular synthesizer does not give you some of the robust options that a modern synthesizer would. Right. So this isn't giving you an option between a sine, a saw, and all that kind of stuff. It sort of has the waveform already built in, and then you can manipulate that waveform in different ways with your different options here. And so there are different types of, synthesizers that will do different things depending on what you're looking for. And so we'll get into that all in future videos. But for today, you should have at least a basic understanding of the four main parts of a standard synthesizer, at least when it comes to your basic synthesizers, like subtractive, additive, that kind of thing. You have your oscillation section, your filter section, your envelope section, or ADSR envelope section, and then an LFO section. And then you can use those to combine and create different sounds, which we will go into in future videos, and we'll try and cover some of the different types of synthesis and kind of how the basic applications of them. We probably won't go into all of them, largely because I don't either have the types of synthesizers currently that some of these are doing, or I don't have a full understanding of all of the different types of synthesizers or synthesis that exist out there. But I'll do my best to go over the the major ones and how you can use them to create some very cool sounds of your own that you can incorporate into your own audio productions. But you should have a little bit, at least the basic understandings to start maybe playing around with some of the synthesizers that you might currently have and understand how to use them a little bit in order to start the process. And we'll go into more detail in future videos. So anyways, with that, I hope you guys have a wonderful day, a wonderful week, and I will talk to you later. Bye-bye.